When you think of Moses, what comes to mind? Prophet, leader, lawgiver, right? But what if he was also a high priest? Now that sounds like a simple yes or no question, but for the ancient rabbis, it was the start of this incredible detective story. It's just packed with legal paradoxes and tiny textual clues. So today, we're diving straight into the Talmud to follow that exact investigation, step by step.
So it all kicks off with this really bold claim from a 3rd century sage, known simply as Rav. He just comes out and says it. Moses, our teacher, held the highest religious office in the land. And that one statement, that one little sentence, sets off a debate that echoes for generations. We're going to follow every single twist and turn.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with Rav's opening argument, and then we'll see how the other sages immediately put it to the test. From there, we'll look at the strange case of his sister Miriam, and consider a totally different title for Moses. Then, you'll see how this debate is actually way older than we thought, before we finally dig into the very limits of Moses' power.
Okay, let's get right into it. What was Rav's argument even based on? I mean, like any good legal mind, he didn't just pull this out of thin air. He came with a receipt, and his receipt was from the holiest text of all, the Torah itself.
But first, let's be really clear about what's at stake here. The high priest, the Kohen Gadol, this wasn't just some job. This was the person who could enter the Holy of Holies, the spiritual center of the entire nation. It was a role that was all about lineage, passed down from Moses' brother, Aaron. So to suggest that Moses, an outsider to that line, held this title, that is a truly radical idea. So here it is. This is Rav's smoking gun. It's a verse from Leviticus. During the big ceremony to inaugurate the tabernacle, Moses gets a sacred piece of an offering. And partaking in that sacrificial meat, that was a privilege strictly, and I mean strictly for priests. So for Rav, this is pretty much an open and shut case. See? He ate the meat, he must be a priest.
But this is the Talmud. And in the Talmud, no theory, no matter how good it sounds, gets a free pass. The second Rav presents his evidence, the other sages start their cross-examination, pulling out totally different texts to poke holes in his argument.
Okay, so the first challenge is a really interesting one. It comes from a whole other discussion about a sin offering that got burned by mistake. The sages are wondering, hey, why wasn't it eaten? They ask, wasn't Pinhas, who they knew was a priest, with them? But here's the thing. If Moses was also a high priest, why didn't they ask, hey, wasn't Moses with them? The fact that they don't even mention his name, well, that silence is deafening.
But of course, Rav's defenders have an answer. They say, look, you can't compare Moses to anyone else. He was unique. He was in constant communion with the divine presence, the Shekinah. He was basically on a direct line to God 24/7. He was just too busy with, God to be available for regular priestly stuff. It's a defense that actually makes Moses sound even more important.
So the next challenge comes from an even older source, something called a Baraita. And this ancient teaching talks about how certain sacred foods were allowed to be eaten by both a priest and a non-priest. The challengers just pounce on this. Who could this mysterious non-priest be if not Moses himself? This seems to blow Rav's whole theory out of the water.
But then, a sage named Rav Sheshit comes in with this absolutely brilliant counterargument. He says, you're all misreading the text. It's not about Moses at all. He argues it's talking about a very specific, temporary time in history when non-priests were allowed to sacrifice on their own private altars. And just like that, with one clever reinterpretation, he completely neutralizes the evidence.
All right, so the next piece of the puzzle isn't from some dry legal text. It actually comes from a dramatic family crisis. The moment Moses' very own sister, Miriam, is struck with leprosy.
Now, according to Torah law, if someone shows signs of leprosy, a priest has to come, inspect the marks, and officially declare the person pure or impure. This is a huge priestly responsibility. But with Miriam, the fact that she's family, well, that creates a major legal headache. And this creates this amazing legal gridlock. On the one hand, an ancient text that analyzes this very scene says Moses couldn't inspect her because he was a non-priest. Okay, but on the other hand, Aaron, the actual high priest, couldn't do it either because he's her brother, and you can't have a relative judging the case. So they're stuck. Who on earth is supposed to handle this?
And the solution, honestly, it's just mind-blowing. When human law hits a dead end, God steps in. The text says the Holy One himself basically says, okay, I'll be the priest. I will quarantine her, I will declare her a leper, and I will exempt her.
It's this incredible moment where God just intervenes directly.
Now, this looks like the nail in the coffin for Rav's theory, right? The source literally calls Moses a non-priest, plain and simple. But wait, the defense has one last trick up its sleeve. They argue that the laws about leprosy are just different. The Torah specifically says the person has to be brought to Aaron the priest, or into one of his sons. They claim that wording deliberately carves out a special exception just for Aaron's family for this one task, so it excludes Moses but maybe doesn't say anything about his overall priestly status. It's a long shot, but it's all they've got.
Okay, so just when you think you've got a handle on this, the whole debate takes a sharp turn. If Moses wasn't a priest, then what was he? Well, a new piece of evidence suggests another title, one that's just as powerful: king.
The Talmud brings up this teaching about the 5 great joys in the life of Elisheva, who was Aaron's wife. Now look at this list of the powerful men in her family. Her husband is the high priest. Her son is his deputy. Her grandson is the special priest for war. And her brother-in-law, Moses, is described as a king. Now pay close attention to what he is not called.
So the challenge is obvious, right? If he was the high priest, wouldn't that be the title you'd mention? It's a pretty big deal. Calling him king seems to imply that was his real job, not high priest. But the comeback is just so simple, it's almost elegant. They just say, why does it have to be one or the other? Maybe the text just means he was a king in addition to being a high priest.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. The Talmud reveals that this whole argument we've been following, it's not new. It turns out Rob and his colleagues are actually refighting a battle that goes back centuries. They're echoing a much, much older debate.
And the root of that ancient disagreement, it turns out, is the famous scene at the burning bush. You know, when Moses keeps making excuses and hesitates to take on his mission? The Torah says that God's anger burned against him, and the early sages all asked a very simple question. What was the actual consequence of God's anger? And how you answer that question? Well, it determines everything. And this one event, believe it or not, led to 3 totally different takes on the whole situation. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai thought that God's anger made Moses lose the priesthood for good, and it was given to Aaron instead. The rabbis took a middle ground saying, well, Moses was a priest, but only for the 7 days of the tabernacle's inauguration. And then there's a third group, just called Some Say, who argued that Moses kept his priesthood his whole life, but the punishment was that his sons couldn't inherit it. And Rav's original claim, it lines up perfectly with this third view. He's channeling a very old tradition.
And you know, this whole idea of temporary versus permanent power, it doesn't just stop with the priesthood. The sages applied the exact same kind of logic to Moses' kingship, debating whether that role was just for him or if it was supposed to be a dynasty.
You see the pattern here, right? A sage named Ulla claimed Moses was denied kingship, but he got immediately challenged with that source we already saw, the one that called him a king. So they had to refine the argument. Okay, Ulla basically says, he was a king during his lifetime, but God said no when he asked for it to become a dynasty for his sons. So in this view, both his priesthood and his kingship were incredibly powerful, but ultimately they were personal. They weren't hereditary.
In the end, the Talmud doesn't give us a clear winner. Rav's claim is never really proven, but it's never fully disproven either. And, that's kind of the whole point. The goal is never to just write a simple entry in an encyclopedia for Moses. It was to wrestle with the text, to explore all the complicated ideas about leadership, about power, and about legacy. The fact that the debate is never resolved is what makes Moses such an endlessly fascinating figure. It leaves us with a question. What does it mean for a leader's power to be so immense, yet so personal, that its true nature remains a mystery thousands of years later?